Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about all of life through the prism of food. And this week, I'm talking to Dr. Rupy Aujla about his latest book, Dr. Rupy Cooks.
When I started writing down recipes for my patients, I was running really late in clinic because I would be ferociously writing down things for people to take away, and that's where the idea of like putting this stuff on social media came from, where I could just say, look, go to the doctor's kitchen, follow one of the recipes that you like the look of, and just try and start creating a habit around eating for health.
He's a best-selling author, a BBC presenter, a podcaster. His podcast, The Doctor's Kitchen, is massive. His Instagram following is in 6 figures, and yet somehow he manages to make it to work as a GP. If anyone can change the narrative about why healthy eating is so important for the whole society, it's Dr. Rupy. And of course, it all starts in the gut.
So gut health is a really interesting area because it sounds really sexy and novel and, avant-garde, but actually, if you look at traditional medicine, whether it's traditional Chinese medicine, whether it's Ayurvedic medicine, they all say the same thing. Health starts in the gut, right? And I've had plenty of I told you so's from my family when I started getting into this and start looking to the research. We're like, we told you it's all about getting variety in, it's about getting probiotics, pickles, all that kind of stuff. There's a reason why cultures from across the world all have these types of foods in their way of eating. And when I wrote my first book back in 2017, I was looking at food through the lens of, nutritional medicine like gut health, epigenetics, the ability of food to switch certain genes on and off, not the sequence of your genes, obviously, as well as anti-inflammatory diets, the Mediterranean way of eating. But really, I'm piggybacking off decades of research, of scientific research, but also thousands of years of just tradition and practice. So I think even though it sounds really novel to talk about gut health today, I think it's pretty much baked into the way we have learned how to eat throughout evolution.
Rupy, you say you're on a mission to help everybody leverage the incredible power of food. Now, we are all over healthy food and gut health and all that kind of stuff, and we'll go into that. But how do you reach everybody?
It's a really important question. I think it would be ambitious of me to say that I, as a single person, can influence every single inhabitant of the UK. And really, what I can do is start having the conversations and getting the messages across to as many people that I can within my locus of influence, and influence people in other sectors to do their best as well. So one way in which I can do that is using my little microphone, which is the podcast, which is why I have conversations with scientists, people in the medical profession, people within medical education as well, getting everyone talking about nutritional medicine and the science behind food. But then I also have conversations with chefs, with people in the catering industry, people who operate wonderful charities like One Feeds Two or Fair Share, people like Sheila Dillon, who has an incredible audience as well. And getting them thinking about food as medicine, but also accessibility. I had a really good conversation with Jonathan Pauling, who I'm sure you come across before, CEO of the Alexandra Rose charity, who are piloting food vouchers that can be exchanged at local food markets for fresh, healthy food. And this is like the first step, I would say, toward this crazy idea that I was thinking of just a couple of years ago about what would the NHS look like if we were able to prescribe healthy food. And they're actually piloting this study in Brixton. I'm actually visiting them later on this week. And we're going to really get into like what that potentially could look like for me as a GP and having that ability to prescribe healthy food. So yeah, to answer your question, it's a really difficult position to say, we want to get this message not just to those who can afford the time and the effort and, the ability to go to their local farmers market, but also the people who are on the breadline, people that we see as general practitioners day in, day out in the NHS who are struggling with multiple jobs and feed their children, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, I think it's from my perspective, it's all about trying to influence as many people using my little microphone and engaging with people who are doing some wonderful things, far, far better than I could ever imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I did a programme for Channel 4 30 years ago about the Mediterranean diet, and then wrote the book, my first book, The Mediterranean Health Diet. At that time, I was interviewing people who were saying exactly the same. The Mediterranean diet was being prescribed by doctors at that time for people who just didn't have access to healthy diets for all sorts of reasons. We know more about that now. We know about how important it is to eat healthily while you're pregnant. We know about food deserts. We know about the impact of junk food around schools. The campaigns are really making those things clear. And I'm not sure whether it's changing the narrative, because here you are saying that, 30 years on, healthy food could be prescribed on the NHS. Yesterday we heard from Henry Dimbleby saying that he's resigning as food staff for the government because actually he's banging his head against a brick wall. You're absolutely right. You can keep talking to people, but actually you are talking to within the echo chamber. Yeah. You've got hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram, people really listening to you, and all these things do change the narrative. I wrote another book recently about TV chefs and their influence, Jamie Oliver and all those kind of really life-changing programmes on television. And I interviewed the then Director General of the BBC, and he said, actually, if you get the middle classes changing the narrative of food, it does influence the entire food culture. And what we're seeing now in 2023 is a very different food culture. We're talking about gut health in a way, though, that really changes the narrative again. It's that kind of, something new factor. Is that what you're trying to do with this book?
In my first book, in 2017, during that time, there was a lot of wellness bashing, particularly of young 20-something-year-old women from both the UK, US and Australia about how they were directing the narrative around well-being without really having...
Clean eating.
Yeah, clean eating and without really having any sort of scientific background. And I remember, being in the midst of this sort of media furor, and I can understand people's anger towards this sort of narrative. But at the same time, taking on board your point about influencing the quote-unquote middle classes, what those people and social media influencers actually did was actually create a new culture where drinking green juices and having kale in your diet was cool. And I think there's some benefits from that. I actually think that having that kind of influence and getting people thinking about healthy eating as something to aspire toward, it's probably a net benefit. And I say that with reservation because I want to be very empathic about the impact on eating disorders. But I think overall, getting people thinking about this way of eating is probably a good thing. And it's up to people like myself who can lend a clinical perspective, lend a scientific lens to nutritional medicine and food as medicine, for us to sort of steer the direction of where healthy eating should be going, and also who should be able to access that. And the obvious answer to that is everyone. And so, taking on board that point about, influencing as many people as possible, starting with the middle classes, making it cool, making it aspirational, I think probably would open it up to as many people as possible.
Well, it's interesting because, that book that I wrote is all about how aspiration can change your diet and create food culture. And, that happened. I mean, I was just literally telling the stories of the people who made Jamie Oliver and who made, food cool back in the end of the 90s, early 2000s. And it did change food culture. But we don't watch television anymore, not really. I mean, you're a BBC presenter, so you could tell me the sort of the background of that one. But actually, people don't really get very much information, certainly not the majority of people. I mean, how important is television to you in your messaging?
It's a really good point. I mean, if you ask my friends who are all, mid to late 30s, some of my younger friends in the 20s, they're getting all their information via their phones or via their laptops. When it comes to people who tend to buy my books, it's generally an older audience, who still watch things like TV in the evenings, like people like my parents, who are in their 60s, and they still use the TV as their main resource. And actually, if you're looking at people who are most aware, I would say, of the need to change their diet on a tighter time scale, it's most likely going to be that generation of people. Although I want people to start thinking about this a lot earlier. And actually, I remember writing in my second book, Eat to Beat Illness, about the chapter on cardiovascular health. And the first paragraph was something along the lines of, you might be inclined to skip this section because you think it only applies to whether you're, if you're 50 years old and you've got high cholesterol and your GP is telling you to change your diet. But actually, cardiovascular health starts as early as your teens. And we should really be, creating a culture where we're all thinking about looking after our hearts, our brains, our immune system at a lot earlier stage in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I made an episode of the Food Foundation podcast only 2 months ago about the importance of maternal health, and there is significant research to show that obesity starts in the womb. Let's drill down. Just give us a picture of why the gut is the beginning and the end of everything. What is it about the gut that we really need to understand?
When we talk about gut health, we're really talking about the gut microbiota, which is the fancy name for the microbes that live in and around our body, but largely concentrated in the large intestine, also known as the colon. It's about 2 or 3 pounds of material. And whilst it's largely made up of bacteria, it also contains things like fungi, nematodes, viruses. And actually, I think we're scratching the surface when it comes to viruses in particular. A lot of people now have heard of the microbiome and the bacteriome, but actually the virome is something that hasn't really been explored in a lot of detail. And I wouldn't be surprised if suddenly we start thinking about viruses in a very different way. Yeah, in the same way we're now looking at bacteria. 99% of the bacteria that we have in our body is doing a good thing to us. But if you're asking the same question 40 or 50 years ago, when we started using antibiotics more regularly, most people would think about bacteria or microbes in general as something uniquely bad.
Germs.
So I think there's going to be a change of thinking in that. Yeah, germs in general, yeah. And so this microbiota, or this microbiome, which specifically refers to the genetic material of all the different microbes that make up the microbes that live in our body but largely concentrate in the large intestine, they are responsible for digesting food, maintaining blood sugar balance, improving the health of the gut lining itself. They create metabolites. They have an impact on brain well-being and your mental well-being. They literally communicate with your brain.
It's called the second brain, isn't it?
Yeah. They're calling it the second brain, the second immune system, the forgotten organ. There's all these different sort of ways in which to describe the importance of this population, and it is absolutely fascinating. For as sexy as it is to talk about the microbiota, and as interesting as it is, and as complex as it is, the solutions of looking after your gut are not as complicated as we'd like to believe. It doesn't really matter about getting a specific strain of microbes in your fermented food or a probiotic capsule. There's some really simple things that we can do to improve the population and ensure it thrives such that it looks after our bodily systems. And I summarize that in the book with 3 things. It's polyphenols, prebiotics, and getting plants into your diet. What do those mean? So polyphenols are the thousands of different chemicals that you find in coloured vegetables. So whether it's your humble apple or cranberry or beets, all these things have important micronutrients like vitamins and minerals, of which there are 22, that we see as essential. But actually, there are thousands of other chemicals that confer benefits to us as well as the plant themselves. And these haven't actually been studied in an incredible amount of detail. We're actually still, again, scratching the surface about all these different chemicals, some of which you would have heard of, things like resveratrol, as many wine drinkers would have heard of, or flavonols that you find in chocolate, dark chocolate, quercetin that you'll find in things like onion and garlic and other allium vegetables. But there are literally thousands of them that you consume when you have a whole ingredient in your food. And so the aim of the game is to try and get as many different types of polyphenols as possible, which is also where you have this other sort of thing that's coming out in the ether about these 30 different plant varieties that you want in your weekly diet.
Is it something as easy as saying go for highly coloured vegetables?
Yeah, it is. And I would say that there seems to be some sort of trend towards only going for the coloured varieties rather than the sort of white varieties. So, instead of going for the white onion, you should go for the red onion, or instead of going for tender stem broccoli, you should go for purple sprouting broccoli. And I would say that's a bit of a dangerous game because yes, white onion doesn't look as attractive, and it doesn't. And now that you know about polyphenols and colors, you want to go for the brightly colored ones. Really, diversity is the spice of life here. So you want to try and get as much variety as possible, because in the white onion, you might have some more of those things like quercetin and allicin and all these other chemicals, whereas in the red onion, you might get more of the anthocyanins. And just because we know a bit more about anthocyanins, which are what give these ingredients the red color, doesn't necessarily mean that that's better than all the other ones. So it's really about getting as much variety as possible, and that's sort of the aim of the game.
But I suppose, if you're looking through, so we're in March now, and you're walking through your supermarket or your market preferably, and you are looking at all the different colours of the vegetables, particularly if you're looking locally and, particularly seasonally, you're going to be seeing a lot of green.
Yeah.
You're going to be seeing a lot of brassicas, aren't you? How do you up your game? You're not going to be finding tomatoes. So, we've got tomato shortages because of the hurricanes in Morocco at the moment, which brings our attention to the impact of climate change on the way that we eat and our relationship with different countries around the world, and throws up all sorts of, ethical questions around that. So local, seasonal, if you possibly can, but you've just got green. So, and potatoes and root vegetables, probably for another couple of months, haven't we? How do you do that ethically? How do you keep stimulating your gut?
Yeah.
And that is the thing, isn't it? Keep it adventurous, keep it excited. How do you do that and think ethically about how you're keeping your carbon footprint down?
Yeah, it's a really good point. There are a variety of different ingredients that we actually grow here in the UK now. It also applies to things like pulses, so things like cowpeas, fava beans, all the things that are sort of less fashionable. We tend to go for the kind of legumes that we're more familiar with. Those also count as varieties. They also have their own different types of plant chemicals that are uniquely beneficial for us. We're also lucky in this day and age that we can rely on frozen food. And this sort of leans on to, my sort of work with BBC Food and some other organisations looking at the accessibility of trying to get as many different types of plants in people's diets whilst being conscious of a budget as well. And then spices. Spices are incredible concentrated sources of these polyphenols. And yes, they come from all over the place, and we tend to get a lot of our exotic spices from abroad, but they also store very well. and they inject a lot of flavour as well as those colours and the polyphenols that we want in our cooking. In addition to that, with the polyphenols, you also have the other two P's, so prebiotics and plants. So when you're having a plant-heavy diet, and just to clarify, I'm not vegan or vegetarian. I'm largely plants, and I call myself plant-focused or plant-driven, or plant-forward. When you have more plants in your diet, you're going to be consuming a greater variety, hopefully, of all these different types of ingredients. And that is, again, uniquely beneficial for our microbes that thrive on all these different interesting substrates or sources of food. And prebiotics are those unique fibers that are super specialized and your microbes specifically enjoy. And they're called prebiotics because they are positioned such that they will improve the survivability of your microbes and actually encourage diversity of those populations. And they're very simple ingredients. It's things like onions and chicory, artichoke, garlic, all the things that we are fermentable and very accessible as well in most supermarkets.
Yeah. I mean, let's put some pictures around those. I used your book when it first came through. I had a writing retreat that weekend and everybody was looking through the book, and I only used the book for the writing retreat. So I cooked a wild mushroom rice with fennel and courgette. I did the greens in a spicy sesame sauce. I did the herby leeks with chickpeas and feta.
Nice.
It's easy food, isn't it? I mean, interesting. I mean, we'll go through your food moments very quickly to kind of put some more colour around that. But these are really super easy and very accessible and not expensive foods, aren't they? I mean, just tell me the 4 food moments that you've chosen. The prawn saganaki, for example. Just go through very quickly, what's in that so that we can taste it as you're talking about it.
One thing I always want to get across with my cooking, because this was born out of necessity, right? I've been working in the NHS for over 14 years. When I started writing down recipes for my patients, I was running really late in clinic because I would be ferociously writing down things for people to take away. And that's where the idea of like putting this stuff on social media came from, where I could just say, look, go to the doctor's kitchen, follow one of the recipes that you like the look of, and just try and start creating a habit around eating for health. And so most of my recipes are super simple, one pan, focus on vegetables, very interchangeable with the ingredients. We usually put alternatives in for each ingredient as well, so it caters for seasonality as well as access, and they're budget friendly. And so, but the other thing I also do is I want to reflect the rich culinary heritages of the people that I see. So I'm lucky to work in a city in the UK, like many cities across the UK, in addition to London. We have people from all different types of background: Korean background, Sri Lankan background, Ghanaian background, you name it, we've got it. And they all have their rich history of food. And so one thing that you'll notice across all my cookbooks, in particular this one, is that it skips through different cuisines, because I want people to understand that just because these are using the principles of a Mediterranean way of eating doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be Mediterranean flavored. You can flavor it according to whatever cuisine you love and you want to eat. And so the prawn saganaki is a great example of that. This actually came from a holiday. I went on a holiday with a good friend of mine, 2 good friends of ours who are gynecologists. One of whom is Greek, and he took us to Thessaloniki, and we went down one of the peninsulas in late September because, top tip for anyone, it's end of season, it's a lot cheaper, and it's near empty. So you get the whole place to yourself, and you have real delicious food that mostly the locals have. And I remember sitting down having this saganaki, and I was like, this is like nothing I've ever had before outside Greece. It is absolutely rich and delicious, and I want to I want to mimic this flavor in a way that's accessible for so many people at home, where, you know, it won't be authentic. It won't be exactly how this person's made it, because no doubt they've put a ton of feta in it, and they're like, you know, a local honey that has a particular scent as a result of the, you know, the bees and all the rest of it. So I can't mimic it exactly, obviously, but I want people to have that sort of the experience. And so the prawn saconete that I've made is, you know, deliberately inauthentic. It's got things like nigella seeds in, it's got oregano, it's got, you know, chopped tomatoes you can get from a can, but it does have the richness of the sauce with the feta and the honey in it. You know, we cook it down for not too long. I mean, the original one will be cooked down for a lot longer, so you can really intensify those flavors, but enough such that you get the sweetness of the tomatoes. And obviously, we're not as lucky as our Mediterranean cousins over here, where they have like wonderful tomatoes. You know, there's a real big difference with the tomatoes that you have in your local supermarket versus the ones that you can get in Europe. But, you know, that being said, we can still have, like, you know, the breadth of
they're still tomatoes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and yeah, you just create that base and you put your prawns in. You can make it very easily vegetarian because I use beans. And you'll notice a theme in my recipes. There's a lot of variety of different legumes, because A, they're accessible, B, they have the benefit of the extra fiber. And these are things that we need to get used to eating, particularly in today's day and age, actually, I would say, because, you know, we want to try and get as much fiber into people's diets. We really lack fiber across the population. And getting those sorts of legumes into our diet is a really easy way of increasing fiber protein in a way that isn't going to overload your micros if you're just looking at meats.
It's a fantastic way of kind of just pulling all your ideas and, you know, the result of experience and scientific rigour in one dish. Interestingly, the Ayurvedic Jewish penicillin does the same thing in a very different way. You know, Ayurveda is thousands of years old. You know, Jews have been eating chicken soup for the soul for, you know, thousands of years. Tell me about this dish.
I did a show with Sheila Dillon for the food program a couple of years ago, and she invited Levi Roots, a rabbi, and me to create a comforting dish that's for the soul as well as health. And the rabbi obviously did chicken soup. I did an Ayurvedic style dish that my mum had taught me many years ago. And Levi Roots did like a goat curry. And I just remember thinking, like, trying this soup, and I was like, I've got to try and combine those delicious spices of my Indian heritage with the nourishing comfortness of the chicken soup. And that's where the sort of two came together. And this is something that we tend to make every couple of weeks. So, you know, the Ayurvedic Jewish penicillin is, you know, as you can tell, really inauthentic, but something that warms my soul and people absolutely love. We had over 1,000 testers for these recipes before we finalized the recipes and put them in the book, and the Ayurvedic Jewish penicillin was one of the most favorited dishes. So it's, yeah, definitely one to try.
Fantastic. And the sticky, tangy green beans. I mean, I love the fact that you don't buy into this time poor narrative, but actually a lot of the dishes that you create are very quick, and this one is fantastic. It uses really wonderful flavours, but you can knock it up in 5 minutes, can't you?
Yeah, this is a firm favourite of mine. So greens, sautéed or blanched. You have lentils, obviously, some red peppers. But everything about this dish comes down to the dressing. And the dressing is sweet, sticky, tangy. It is absolutely delicious. It's reduced tamarind. You can get in most supermarkets these days, tamarind paste. Molasses, black vinegar, or you can use another type of vinegar. We'll put alternatives in there. And just reducing that over about 8 to 10 minutes is all you need to create this sticky glaze that just lifts the green beans like nothing else. And I remember having this sticky sauce when I was in Australia. I used to live in Australia, and I was there very recently with my wife in an Asian restaurant, and they'd put it over some tempura. And I remember like trying this, and I spoke to the the waiter and I spoke to the chef. Obviously, they wouldn't give me the recipe, but I had to sort of remember exactly the flavouring, the taste of that. And I spent literally about a week, that following week when I was in Australia, trying to recreate the flavour as like just, with using all the different ingredients I could find out there. And I nailed it. And now I use it in the recipe, and it's I just became obsessed with it. But it's a wonderful dressing. You can use it on loads of different things.
And using that idea, your fourth food moment is your deconstructed cherry ripes, and it's again about how to make something really sweet that is okay. It's sugar that's the problem, isn't it? It's white processed sugar that is as harmful as the other white stuff. But you don't have to use sugar to make things sweet, and they can be good for you. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, everything really comes down to dose, and this is what I say to everyone. Like you'll hear things like if you look over the last couple of decades, you'll hear things about fat, you'll hear things about sugar now, whatever the sort of devil du jour is. It really comes down to dose. I always say like you can poison someone with water. But water is one of the most important, if they're not the most important substance that we have, and ever more so as well with water scarcity. So it really comes down to dose. And so when I use sugar in my recipes, it's at the appropriate amount to impart the required flavor, but also not overpowering the bitter notes and all the rest of it. And so this recipe is my deconstructed cherry ripe. Cherry ripe is a really popular sweet that I remember having when I was working in ITU and A&E in Australia as like my midnight snack. When I was working night shifts. And it's, for any Australians, they don't know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like this dark chocolate with a rich cherry jelly. It's not very good for you. It's full of E numbers and all the rest of it. And it has like a coconutty sort of flavor to it as well, similar to a lamington. And so with this recipe, I just mashed together desiccated coconut, some dried cherries. I used the juice of like some macerated cherries, and then put a dark chocolate, 75% lid on the top, and I put it in a ramekin. And that way you'd like dive into almost like a creme brulee. With your spoon, you have like these shards of dark chocolate, and then you have the sort of coconutty cherryness, and it's so similar to the cherry ripe, and I really prefer this now. It's actually one of the most popular sweets that we have, and it's definitely better for you because you have the fiber from the dried cherries, you have the coconut, you have the dark chocolate with those flavanols, but it's not something that you feel guilty about afterwards, and that's something I think is really important.
It's 5 years on since the sugar tax, and I totally get what you mean about dose, but actually we need to change the culture about sugar use, don't we? When you've got people coming in to see you who have obesity-related diseases, type 2 diabetes, heart issues, what do you tell them about sugar? Is it as simple, and I know it's not, as saying it's a dose issue?
I think it's a multifactorial issue. You're right in that it's not just the fact that people need to reduce their dose of sugar, because I think in a lot of cases people aren't aware of just how much sugar they're consuming, because it's insidious. It's in everything. It's in our jams, our sauces, our breads, our healthy items, the heavily marketed good for you products are generally laden with different types of sugars that are natural but are still as harmful as the highly processed white stuff. And then you have the issue of marketing to the most financially vulnerable with the cheapest foods that seem like a good idea and seem like you're saving money, but actually you're not satiating yourself, and it can be just as expensive in the long run, particularly if you weigh up the cost of ill health and the cost of loss of productivity and all the rest of it. What I'm also seeing actually is it's not just a problem of the working classes. It's not just an issue with those who can't afford to eat, from their local market or choose organic or whatever it might be. It's everyone. And actually, I think the big reckoning is a lot of my colleagues who are medics are now being diagnosed with pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. And that's when the penny drops. And that's when people start thinking about the food environment a lot more holistically. And I feel like, we are right for a culture change, but I tell you what, it's not going to come from calorie counting or calorie counts on menus. It's not going to come from reformulations. Honestly, it's going to come from creating a culture where we look at healthy foods cooked from scratch, as the norm and not healthy. That's the real big change we need to instill.
Thanks for listening. Do follow me on Instagram. I'm at FoodGillySmith, and on Substack, where you'll find a little extra bites to accompany the episode. Just search for Gilly Smith on Substack, and I'll see you next week.